This is San Francisco.
It's Toshio. In the 1960s, the head of the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, Justin Herman, was plotting the demolition of hundreds of old Victorian homes owned by Black and Asian people in Central SF. In his own words, "This land is too valuable to let poor people park on it." Justin Herman reigned over urban renewal projects here at the same time as the freeway revolts, these massive protests against 10 sections of freeway that the city's planning department intended to build around San Francisco. The city was planning to bulldoze people's homes and take the land using eminent domain laws. But as a result of the freeway revolts, local politicians voted to cancel 7 out of 10 of the roads that would have cut through the city. However, the new freeways that were built included the Central Freeway, a double-decker freeway that cut through what most people call Hayes Valley today. And to build it, the city and developers leveled hundreds of homes of mostly Black people in Western Addition. 30 years later, this section of freeway was torn down when the 1989 earthquake hit. And now, in the tradition of Justin Herman, we have Mayor London Breed and the Yimbys at Grow SF, who are all trying to block affordable housing in part of Hayes Valley known to planners as Parcel K. And that's a plot of land where there's now a lawn with rotating Burning Man statues that was set aside for affordable housing years ago, and now Breed and Grow SF are trying to keep Parcel K wealthy and white. San Francisco as a show is an attempt to show how there's always been resistance to landlords and Yimbys and mayors and urban planners. Niccolo Calderaro, who teaches in the anthropology department at SF State, just published a piece in the journal Progressive City that's linked in the show notes. And it speaks to some of the gentrification in Central SF that I was describing, and also describes parts of the resistance to things like the SF Redevelopment Agency and Justin Herman and gentrification in the 1960s and 70s, including the work of Charles or Chester Hartman, who was the very rare left-leaning urban planner. Here is that interview. I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about how you came to write the article, how you came to do work around planning in San Francisco.
Well, the first question relates to changes that have taken place over the last 60 years, and a book that I wrote that came out on the process of people trying to save their homes in San Francisco back in the 70s and 60s and 70s. And what I saw as a young student who was asked to go into the Western Addition and go door to door and look at the effect that redevelopment was having on the neighborhoods in San Francisco. That project was led by Louis Chemnitzer. And through that process, I met Charles Hartman, who was a housing specialist, advocate, one might say, who was doing a lot of work looking at, he was educated as a planner. He was doing a lot of work in how the cities in America were changing and how those changes, both obviously because of replacement housing, development of downtowns, introduction of new building materials and methods, et cetera, was affecting people's lives, which isn't always the foremost idea in front of everyone. And in fact, what I began to learn as I was going door to door was that there were actual human-created entities within the cities, so that we call sometimes communities or neighborhoods, and that these entities were actually in direct opposition to the process of development that was taking place. Some because of the economics, and others because people like to live where they're living and they don't like to be moved around very much.
That fully makes sense. And again, relates a lot to what we're seeing today with gentrification and displacement in the city. Briefly, could you describe for people who might not be aware, and I realize that this is a gargantuan issue and we could spend days trying to define What was redevelopment?
One of the interesting articles that was written during the post-war period was an article by a guy named Fossum. And Fossum was a lawyer who was engaged in looking at people's housing needs and how housing law was changing, all around an idea called substandard housing and standardizing building methods. There was, during the period of the Depression, there was a lot of pressure on looking at how people were living, but at the same time, people were being forced across the country for a variety of reasons, obviously the Dust Bowl, et cetera. But these movements, people were living pretty much anywhere as we see today, where we have a lot of people who are unhoused. And so the question of standard housing and standardized housing, which had been a focus at the turn of the century when people were found living in tenements and what were called cold water flats, where whole families were living in one room. My father grew up in Harlem, and he grew up in a tenement that had no hot water, and his family of 7 people lived in one room, and they used a toilet and a bath at the end of the hall for most of the time that they lived in Harlem. But those buildings were considered to be standard at one point during the 19th century. And then later, they were considered to be substandard. Now, the same thing was happening at the end of the Second World War when people began to look at the pressures that were on various ethnic groups that were coming back from the war and having fought the war and trying to reward the veterans. And so there's a lot of pressure about housing and the conditions that people were living in on one hand, and on the other, there was a great opportunity to build new housing and to what was considered to be rehouse people. And a lot of money was made up, and some of the entities that had been put in existence during the 30s to build housing and to provide for rural housing, rural electrification, et cetera, that had been done under the FDR administration, was put into motion to try to change the character of American housing. And one of the processes that were involved was to get everyone on board politically and economically, and to provide basically means to entice people to go through this process without much care about the people who were living in the conditions that they were, because it meant really evicting a lot of people from housing that some people considered to be substandard. And then where were they going to go? And this was one of the sterling qualities that were set forward for the redevelopment process. Was in 1947, basically in the end of the Second World War, there was legislation that was drawn up to allow for what was called revitalization of our central cities, and also providing new housing for the veterans who were coming back from the war. And so there was a lot of pressure to create housing and also to change the nature of housing. Now, a lot of people who had been living with one toilet for maybe 200 people in a 4-story walk-up, that was considered to be substandard. But for them living in those buildings, obviously many of them, even though sometimes they were rat infested, sometimes otherwise, it was better than not having any housing. And also the affordability was a problem because wages and rents obviously were low. In the last 50 years, where I've traveled the country and done work up and down California and Pacific Coast, looking at how people lived, and in places like Turkey and Central America, et cetera, that the nature of housing and allowing people to live in structures that they build, there's over 1 billion people today living in what are called vernacular structures that they built themselves, whether they were made out of wood or whatever. And sometimes we call these slums, sometimes we call these, depending upon what country we're in, they are temporary housing. But some temporary housing becomes permanent housing. And we see this in some of the favelas in Brazil, where people are now buying buildings that were temporary 10 years ago for hundreds of thousands of dollars. So the nature of what we're allowing people to live in without relocating them was a discussion that was made at the end of the Second World War. But the whole problem of the quality of housing and its affordability was never really addressed.
So What did redevelopment and revitalization, quote unquote, revitalization, what did it look like in the Fillmore when you first headed out there in 1966?
I came from a farming family in Castro Valley, Hayward, and I was rather shocked by what I saw. As a family, we used to throw up buildings basically on the wood that we could gather ourselves or buy or process ourselves. And the idea that I had of how people should live was one that was related to the nature of really a rural environment. So when I saw the density, even though I knew from my father's background that he had lived in basically what we would today call a slum, what I had never had that experience myself. I had a rural experience. But what I saw was that there was a really, what I considered at the time, a tragedy unfolding, because thousands of people were being evicted from their homes, their possessions thrown out onto the street. And it was rather violent. If you've never been evicted, you really don't understand the nature of losing your home. And the relationship between a tenant and a landlord is something that is specific to the character of the economics involved, but also the nature of the individuals involved. I've rented many buildings in my lifetime. I've dealt with many landlords. My father, when he came back from the Second World War, he was a frontline combat soldier, and he educated himself and became a realtor, and he bought some buildings and became a landlord. And I understood the relationship that he had with his tenants. He never ever had to evict anyone. And that was mainly because he believed that landlords made bad tenants. Bad tenants weren't born. And he also believed that it was the responsibility of the landlord to provide housing that was safe and also basically a place to live that provided people with some degree of dignity. But obviously that requires some degree of resources. What I oftentimes found in the Fillmore when I was going door to door was very different. And the word slum only comes to mind where I saw buildings that had been taken over by the redevelopment agency and had been allowed to deteriorate so much that the tenants in those buildings really were no longer living in a space that was dignified or really provided with the kinds of services and protection that one could define as safe. So the problem that I began to see was one that one could also define as a struggle or a conflict between the people in the Western Addition who were mainly African American and Japanese American. And the Japanese American population had obviously been removed during the Second World War and had to camps and had come back largely in San Francisco. Their property had been retained by friends, and so they had property to come back to, not all of them, but many. And here they had suffered eviction and basically incarceration during the war. Now they came back to another war, a war of attrition to get rid of them so that the property that they had and the buildings that they had could be given over to someone else.
In the article, you do speak about a type of eviction that one city official called informal evictions. And I was wondering if you could describe what these sort of alternative evictions entailed.
Well, actually, I've been really surprised and shocked to find in the last 10 years, the Chronicle has published a number of articles describing the same kind of informal eviction where landlords come and when the people are away at work and they'll take out a water heater or they'll remove a toilet or windows or doors, a heater. This is a type of informal eviction that was taking place also in the Western Addition and South of Market periods during the redevelopment period. But today, it's really unfathomable that it's happening now, that people are getting away with doing this to people who are good tenants who are paying their rent, basically because of landlords attempting to get away from rent control by what I consider to be really criminal acts.
That rent control is still such a controversial point in opposition, though, to what was going on during redevelopment and this quote-unquote revitalization. There were some groups that It's hard to measure successes in these kinds of battles, but I like to assume that if it wasn't for some of these oppositional forces, the situation might be even more dire for the majority of people. One of these forces that you mentioned in the article was TOUR, Tenants and Owners in Opposition to Redevelopment. Could you describe who they were?
They were a group of people who were living south of Market or had their businesses south of Market, and they band together, partly under the advice of people like Charles Hartman, that they could stay, they could fight redevelopment, they could use the actual law, redevelopment law that was drawn up to support the local redevelopment instead of giving over property to new owners, usually corporate owners. And they were able to fight in the courts and politically to be able to stay in their homes and in their businesses. And that wasn't unique. I mean, in the Japanese community, people like Miki Imura and Japanese community fought redevelopment there, and there were a number of victories there as well. In the Western edition, the African American community was highly organized, and they also fought. The unions helped to a certain extent, although the unions were divided because there were jobs. Of course, there's always this problem about the nature of jobs. And, one of the problems that people faced, I think, is that a lot of planners and a lot of liberals, I think, too, were opposed to neighborhoods and neighborhood resistance. And we're seeing this today, too. We're seeing a lot of people being accused of racism because they don't want blockbuster housing put into them, or they're afraid of new housing, et cetera. And they are slandered by being called racist because back in the 50s, developers used what were called blockbusting techniques, where they would present rumors that houses were going to be sold in a neighborhood, oftentimes ethnic neighborhoods of Poles or Czechs or Italians or whatever. And they would say that, oh, they're going to move African Americans in. And so the property values would begin to drop. And as people got scared, and there would also sometimes be violent acts that were perhaps, and this idea that communities were racist and opposed to diversity is being used today again, that neighborhoods are bad, community is bad, these are racist individuals, when really community is what we all need. And we all need a place where we can feel that we can come home at night and our stuff is still going to be there, et cetera. We're going to have some degree of political democracy that we'll be able to participate in. And the atomization of our country and our society is really a step towards fear. But you mentioned rent control, and again, I have to say that rent control is a red herring, because you see so many people, so much propaganda against rent control. But when you look at rent control, and one of the things I know from looking at, for example, Berkeley, nobody loses money owning property in Berkeley that has rent control. And people in one of the highest property valued places in the world, really San Francisco, don't lose money. You'd have to be an idiot. And people tell me these stories, realtors, I oftentimes get into these discussions with them about people who have lost money because of bad tenants, or people who are playing the game of rent control, taking advantage of. And when you chase down the facts, it's made up. It's like the woman supposedly dried her dog in a microwave. It's all urban legend.
What you're describing, I mean, this is like the dignity we were speaking about earlier, like just kind of basic necessities of having a roof over your head. So this is kind of what groups that are pushing for right now to get affordable housing built in Hayes Valley on what currently is a sort of park with like expensive ice cream shops. The same sort of like racist tropes, anti-poor tropes are being used to put a wedge in between people that ostensibly everyone should be for, other people having place to go sleep at night. Can you speak to one of the weaker points of TOUR that Charles Hartman remarked on later? Specifically, he talked about how in strategizing around the fights against the SF Redevelopment Agency, he talked about ceding power to, quote, experts like lawyers and planners.
That's always a problem. What Charles, I think, saw was oftentimes that idea of giving power to experts instead of learning yourself and empowering yourself, or having a community that empowers itself is a problem. And this oftentimes we see sometimes with lawyers doing this with convince a tenant or an owner of a building to capitulate and to give in, be evicted, or give up their property to development. I even have a friend who is a developer who was put a proposal to build a building in San Francisco for low-cost housing, and it was going to be multi-use. And the planning department came back to him after they got pressure from the Builders Association that he had too much affordable housing in his project, and they made him reduce it. And that was because they kept saying that too much affordable housing would decrease the value of other projects. And so they had to make these balance. And one of the things that I see over and over and over again is that you see this promised affordable housing projects. They pass, everybody's for them. And then later when they're built, oh no, they're not affordable. And instead, then the developer will pay a fee to the city, usually through ABAG, the Association for Bay Area Government. And that will be supposedly used to produce affordable housing or to support some kind of housing. And you might recall recently, the treasurer of ABAG was convicted of actually using some of that money for his own benefit. So the problem is the idea is good. We want to have affordable housing. The problem is it seldom ever gets built. In fact, the Public Policy Institute of California did a study published in 2003 by Paul Lewis, and found that basically the housing elements had virtually no effect in building affordable housing. And that's not because builders are evil or investors are evil. It's that we live in a capitalist country, and essentially people want to make a profit. Now, the only real good story we have to talk about are the community development corporations. Since the 70s, which came out of the Community Congress, Calvin Welsh and many other people in San Francisco have pushed for community development corporations to build low-cost housing. Over 80,000 units of housing has been built by these community development corporations. Unfortunately, the Builders Association has been able to politically cut the flow of money to these corporations because they're basically in competition. And so there's a real problem in how our legislators really need to focus the attention on, if they want to build housing, it's not, don't take democracy away from the people, don't hate community, don't destroy neighborhoods, rather empower the people by funding community development corporations.
You know, right now we have a few buildings that have recently opened up in the Mission District. And I mean, it took 10 or more years for each of these projects to go from, oh, the developer is paying to not build affordable housing in their building right now. And so those fees go into like a big pot, come out the other end years and years and years later, when inflation has brought the prices up on all of the construction materials, and you end up getting, fewer units. And by that point in time, you don't know who might have been displaced from the area around the non-affordable building. Who's left in San Francisco. They might have had to move because they couldn't afford what that new market rate construction brought into the neighborhood. In contrast to tours experts, one of the other groups that we spoke about in the article was TAG. Could you speak about their work?
Yeah, Tenants Action Group were tenants, basically. Some of them were lawyers, and they went around educating people about their rights as tenants and using courts to delay eviction or withholding rents so that they could have a greater degree of negotiation with the owners. And the owners faced with tenants who were in the buildings not paying them rent, but withholding the rent legally, was a considerable, sort of equalized the struggle a little bit. And TAG had a lot of success. And one of my friends, Michael Canwright, who is deceased now, but he was really active in going around and helping people in this way.
Today we have Tank, which is the Tenant and Neighborhood Councils group, and they do some of the work that TAG was doing, things like showing up to evictions to stop the cops from entering and taking people away from these homes that they've lived in for years and years. So that work obviously is still important, still continuing. It's just really helpful to have some of this historical context, especially when it feels like sometimes the forces that we're fighting are so gigantic, to know that people have been trying to challenge these forces for as long as there have been, landlords and developers who are only interested in making a buck. Thank you so much, Niccolo. I was wondering if you could let people know where they might learn more about Charles Hartman's work and also your own work.
They could read my book, which is an ethnography of the Goodman building, which is about the tenants there who went on a 10-year rent strike. The building went on the National Register. It was found to be a historic structure, and the tenants were relocated. We made a deal with Diane Feinstein, who was then the mayor. The building was rehabbed. A multi-unit building structure was built. I was on the board of directors of Goodco that built that housing. So that was a great victory, in my mind. And I recommend people to also see Curtis Choi's movie,
Fall of the Eye Hotel, perhaps?
The Fall of the Eye Hotel. It's a great movie about the struggle for housing in San Francisco. There's two versions of the movie. I think the CD is the better one because it shows what happened after all the litigation. The building was torn down, the tenants were evicted, but in the end, community was able to build a new structure, a new housing for the Manila town community and to house elders as the building had functioned before.
Yeah, and for more on that fight, people can check out the interview with Andrew Cito in a previous episode. We'll also link to your book, as well as a link to the piece you spoke about today, Community Mobilization Against Eviction in 1970 San Francisco and Progressive City Journal. Thank you so much, Niccolo.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Sad Francisco, as always produced by Toshio Moronic and Caitlin Wood. If you like the show, please go to patreon.com/sadfrancisco to find out more. And thank you to Sandpaper for supporting the show, and also to Eric Stanley. See you next time in Sad Francisco.